years, the subject of the Philippine government's debt has frequently been used metaphorically. This is probably being caused by two things. The first is that the government is overspending, either through its annual budget or due to its infrastructure-driven administration, which promised a 180 billion US development plan across the archipelago nation of the Philippines. The second is due to the most recent economic catastrophe, COVID-19, which was most likely a black swan occurrence and has had an impact on all economic worldwide. However, the government's build plan, which was unveiled back in 2016, was a massive undertaking. While it may not seem like much in comparison to other countries, when we look at the Philippines' nominal GDP for that year, we can see that the country had only an estimated nominal GDP of $318 billion. According to the World Bank, we can now see the potentially devastating debt loan the Philippines would be forced to take on had it completely implemented the well-known build campaign. Yes, it did, and as a result, we have witnessed a rise in dread among the populace. The total debt of the Philippines as a country has also increased significantly, reaching a record high of almost $229 billion. According to the most recent numbers that were accessible at the time this video was written in March 2022, possibly driven by government expenditure as it fights off economic concern and the country's ongoing quest for infrastructure. Yes, the Philippines continues to borrow money to support its aspiration in spite of widespread concern that even several countries had entered default to their debt. One notable loan occurred when the Philippine government and the Asian Development Bank signed the first tranche of the enormous $4.3 billion loan to finance one of its largest ventures known as the South Commuter Railway project. We may witness an increase in Philippine debt as a result of such problems. Here's why, in contrast, we believe that the Philippines is still pushing for their effort despite its fiscal problems. The debt to GDP ratio, which measures the amount of debt a country has in relation to its gross domestic product, can be used to calculate this. Some economists claim that this is one of the finest methods for determining a country's debt load, if not the best. The amount of debt that the government has already accumulated, such as its $229 billion record high, is not really a good way to gauge how much it owes, because it can be paid off simply as long as the GDP of the country increases, along with other indicators like tax receipts and so on. In light of all that has occurred to date, the Philippines had a debt to GDP ratio of approximately 63.5% as of the first quarter of 2022, which was a ratio last seen in 2005. We have gathered data from the Bureau of the Treasury, Philippines, which demonstrates this. Although it's probably a terrible time in the country's history, that is not the worst event ever. You see, from 1990 to 2000, the Philippines' debt to GDP ratio ranged from a low of about 51.7 to a high of 74.9, making it clear that the country's debt load has actually been far longer over the past few decades. This would indicate that during the past 3 decades, from then to now, the Philippines has managed to battle its debt issues and strengthen its economy. In addition, data from the time this build was introduced in 2016 shows that the Philippines had a debt to GDP ratio of roughly 42.1%. However, by the time it got to 2019, before the cholera pandemic, the debt to GDP has actually decreased to just 39.6%. However, after the economic crisis, things drastically changed. So, did the COVID-19 trigger it? Or did the government's over expenditure on infrastructure have something to do with it? Since it kept spending on its goals even as the crisis was occurring, it might be either. But was doing so the right decision? Well, the real answer to the won't come until the Philippines has fully succeeded in its mega initiatives and is able to get rid of its debt obligations. Because of this, it can help us understand the government's position towards its infrastructure building initiative. Why did it not halt or even reduce its spending as the debt grew? Before we can respond to that, it is important to understand that between 2016, the year the Philippines launched its huge initiative, and 2019, prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, the debt to GDP ratio has dropped in the Philippines. In those 3 years, notable individuals were given the power to sign bills into the law and some billion-dollar loans were made. Although the ratio had decreased until 2016, 42.1%. So, how did this occur? The GDP had increased much more quickly than the amount of government could borrow. To put it simply, we believe this is the reason why government's highest officials and the financial ministries have often indicated that they are capable of continuing their former practices, outgrow its debt and possess the resources necessary to settle incoming repayments. The country would be able to quickly outgrow its debt. According to the country's incoming finance secretary, Benjamin Diokno, provided that the country grows at least 6 to 7%, which it had consequently done in the past. Thus far, in the first quarter of 2022, growth has been 8.3%. Carlos Dominguez, the current finance secretary and a different authority on the subject, has also advised the future administration to prioritize tax efforts like boosting tax rates. Diokno, however, refuted this because he was once more confident in expanding the economy rather than concentrating on tax rate increase. In addition, distinct confidence matter is a subject that has apparently not been adequately adopted to the public's perception. This suggested that we might not even be able to rely just on public confidence to spur economic growth. However, just like Japan, which has a very high debt to GDP ratio, may confidently exceed its debt because to its extremely huge stock of foreign reserves. This is the case with the United States, around $106 billion. These foreign reserves were held by the Philippines, which is in a similar situation. As of April 2022, additionally, the majority of the Philippines' total debt is held by its own citizens. And there is little foreign debt. Only 30% of the overall debt stock came from foreign sources and 70% of it was provided by the country's own citizens. Does that even matter? According to the certain economists and professionals, yes, as American economist Paul Krugman once put it in reference to the US enormous debt, we owe it to ourselves. It is merely an assumption that since the loans the government has come from its own people, they will be less likely to be treated as financial assets by their fellow countrymen. However, because we do not possess economic expertise, it is more challenging for us to discuss the potential effects of Philippines' total internal and external debt without also relying on the opinions of those who do. The Philippines' debt is a concern given what we know thus far. Or it is something we can quickly outgrow and pay off in the upcoming years or decades. Or will the tax rate in the Philippines rise in the upcoming years if we are able to improve our economy? Given that the country has one of the highest rates of taxation in all of Asia, with individual rates as high as 35% and corporate rates at 30%. This is a quite significant amount of money. In order to make sure that the country does truly pay off its debt and has enough money to cover incoming interest payments, we really have to rely on the government's position in society. Additionally, we believe that the new administration should exercise caution, particularly given that the United States is on the verge of recession. It is well known that whenever the Western superpower experiences negative GDP growth, the entire world is affected. This could be a challenge because the Philippines is a country that significantly depends on the US. Additionally, the Philippines is suffering greatly from the high cost of oil and rising local inflation. In the future, there will undoubtedly be many more issues, but the government may not be able to stick to its initial strategy of expanding the economy. Then, it's possible to anticipate another tax reform that will probably raise money. So guys, this was for today. Give us your thoughts on this in the comment section, and if you appreciate our content, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with your family and friends. We will meet you soon in a new video. Thank you. Jai Hind.